So thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. And no, I'm not French. I'm German. But yeah, I could have talked in French. I thought that as the panel was with Clive Hamilton, it would be more practical to talk in English. Whatever. My talk will be about climate governance and about what the Anthropocene narrative can do or does to thinking about climate politics. And so here on this first picture you see a COP that is a meeting of the parties to the Climate Convention. These global gatherings federate each year virtually all countries on the planet, and they do so since 1995. Negotiations on the climate issue are even older if we include those that prepared the signature of the Climate Convention in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. So it has been 25 years that the climate issue is on the global agenda and that governments are meeting and trying to find a response to the problem. If you look at these two graphs, we see that the first one on the left side shows that the climate is already changing. We saw these graphs many times. The second one shows another story. Not only the impacts of those 25 years of negotiation are not visible in terms of CO2 emissions, the rate of emission has even accelerated in the last decade. For those who followed the debate closely, you might remember that recently there was some talk about the stagnation of global CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion and cement production. And many saw in this a first sign of global decoupling between emissions and economic growth. Yesterday morning we learned, or 2 days before now, we learned that Chinese emissions were slightly underestimated. Slightly by 10 to 15%, or 1 billion tons of CO2, which is roughly equivalent, to give you an idea, to German CO2 emissions per year. This, of course, questions, with other evolutions, the optimistic assertion about a global decoupling and the narrative of progress that is currently being circulated by international organizations. So there's a paradox at the heart of this talk and also at the heart of the book that Intervenant and myself published this year, and which is the basis for much of this talk, and which is entitled Gouverner le climat, 20 ans de négociations internationales. The paradox is that we are already governing the climate, of course, because we heavily influence its evolution, but despite 25 years of international efforts, we are incapable as yet of governing the social and political factors that lead to the degradation of the climate. To elucidate this paradox, I propose to take a step aside and to look at some of the deeper causes that have prevented an efficient response to the climate crisis. At the end of the talk, I will come to the notion of Anthropocene and look at what this notion is doing to climate change. In other words, how this notion reframes the climate debate and our understanding of how we can collectively and politically confront the problem of climate change. So, framing the climate problem, here are two images that exemplify, I think, the way climate change is commonly represented in public discourse. The first one displays two ice bears sitting on a small piece of ice. I don't know much about ice bears, I must admit, but the image might suggest that it is a mother with her child. It exhibits the fragility of nature and of the natural equilibria in which we are intervening through global warming. It also shows the global character of climate change. As climate change impacts, here the melting of ice sheets, are displayed in an area that is probably very remote from industrial civilization. The second image shows the global carbon budget that is humanity as a whole, have left if we want to have a fair chance to limit global warming to 2 degrees. We understand from the graph that this global carbon budget will be consumed somewhere between 2030 and 2040 if nothing is done, highlighting the urgency of political action. Together, these two images display some of the basic characteristics of the framing of climate change and of climate politics. Climate change is an environmental problem, a framing that was very prominent and might be changing to some degree now. Climate change is a global problem that concerns humanity as a whole, and climate change as a problem of CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions. We might subsume these features of the dominant framing under the notion a global environmental problem. In order to understand this dominant framing, we have to go back to the 1990s. Three developments favored the specific way of thinking and of discussing the climate issue. First, the early 1990s are characterized by the end of the Cold War. The fall of the Berlin Wall symbolized the hope to see the emergence of a new era of global cooperation. This hope is expressed a few years earlier by the first phrase of the Brundtland Report, published in 1987. The Earth is one, but the world is not. After the Brundtland Report, the Commission on Global Governance issued its report in 1995, giving further shape to a dream of global multilateralism and international rule of law. Second, international action against the acid rain problem and the ozone hole in the 1980s suggested that it was possible to tackle environmental problems through a series of measures like standards, taxes, and markets, emission caps, and burden sharing between countries. Measures that were directed at reducing the emissions of hydrofluorocarbon and sulfur emissions. And they proved rather successful for these two problems. Third element, the physical-chemical definition of climate change as a global phenomenon, with a range of notions attached to it: global mean surface temperature, greenhouse gas concentrations, general circulation models, etc., had a peculiar political translation. In order to ensure global cooperation and avoid free riding, it was thought that the solution to the problem of climate change had to be as global as the problem itself. This framing, I suggest, had important effects on the way the political institutions to confront climate change were built. Three dimensions, again, of such influence can be distinguished. First, on the level of instruments, climate governance, and indeed most of climate policy more generally, aims at all of these policies aim at regulating greenhouse gas emissions, as I said. But there is a problem with such an approach because such end-of-pipe measures exclude important parts of the problem, like questions, for example, of infrastructure that lead to carbon lock-ins. To give an example, highways, once constructed, favor individual transportation in cars against more climate-friendly alternatives like public transportation. Also, questions of fossil fuel extraction and production are not discussed in the negotiations, although we know that once fossil fuels are extracted, they will very probably be burned. Second, on the level of institutions, the climate change regime is separated from a range of other international regimes and institutions, such as those regulating global trade, development, energy security, or finance. This is, of course, absurd if we consider the climate implications of the 1980s, 1990s trade negotiations under GATT and WTO umbrella. The way economic and financial globalization unfolded and unfolds is of paramount importance, and I don't tell you anything new here, for global emissions, but questions of trade are excluded from climate negotiations and vice versa. Third, the all too quick translation, or rather transposition, of the globalism of the physical sciences, but also of economics and of political science that define climate change as a collective action problem, to the political treatment of the climate issue has led to a peculiar or false global framing of the issue. Why false? Of course, the climate is global, but as Bruno Latour reminds us, the global in a political sense does not pre-exist to the political treatment of the problem. It can only be the result of the politics of climate change. Its shape has yet to be invented, and when intergovernmental negotiations have not proven successful yet, global, local networks of action have emerged between cities, between activists and social movements, between economic actors willing to take action. But such networks have no legal standing in the UN system and thus in climate governance more generally. We have chosen the notion of schism of reality to characterize the fundamental disjunction between climate governance, the intergovernmental institutions created to confront climate change, and a range of other processes like the globalization of Western lifestyles, the unbridled exploitation of fossil fuels, ferocious economic competition, and the remilitarization of international relations that contribute to global warming. This growing gap can be traced on different levels, and I will not go into much detail. The scope of climate governance is at the same time too large, as climate negotiations include now a wide array of topics, from forests to biodiversity to energy questions, equity, and so on. But they're also too narrow, because they are separated from other international regimes, as I just told. Also, the disconnection is reinforced by a dramatic difference of pace between UN negotiations that proceed by consensus and include 195 countries, and an external reality that has seen major accelerations in the last decades, in the trades of goods and services, in global energy geopolitics, and so on. To give an example, the Kyoto Protocol has been negotiated since the beginning of the 1990s, at a time when China was the 9th economy of the world, behind Italy. It was signed in 1997 and it entered into force in 2005 in a world that had dramatically changed. China surpassed the US as the biggest greenhouse gas emitter only 1 year later. So, to sum this up, in order for global climate politics to become more than a mere politics of simulation, as says Ingolfo Bludon, we need to rethink climate governance. And first, to reframe what is at stake, so to reframe the climate debate. So, in order to do so, we can first turn to the literature. We don't have to invent the wheel. We can turn to the literature of on the climate change regime. And this literature has recently seen an important turn, from analyzing mainly the UN negotiations, its phases and main actors, to looking at climate governance beyond or outside the UN setting. Very roughly, we can distinguish 3 ways in which the external world is related to the negotiations that we can describe by using 3 popular metaphors. A first group of scholars that you see on the left shifts attention from the tip of the iceberg of climate governance to unveiling its much larger hidden parts, that is, neighboring international organizations and regimes, along with a growing number of transnational climate initiatives. So these scholars are interested in things like regime complexes, regime overlap, conflicts, etc. And also transnational, what they call transnational climate governance. That means all these kinds of links and initiatives that are emerging. A second set of authors urges us to turn rather to the elephant in the room, namely underlying power structures and material configurations in the international system that block effective responses to the climate crisis. These authors use terms like carbon historical blocks to describe it, or also carbon lock-in, and mentioned several times here the work of Timothy Mitchell about carbon democracy that shows the link between the social and political organization and its material subunits. A third group then has argued that instead of looking at the individual trees of climate negotiations, research should focus on the larger forests, made up of overarching framings, discourses, and practices that hinder individual and collective action. And here we could talk about, and some authors do so, about phenomena of cognitive lock-in, or high carbon lifestyles, and the larger patterns that shape actors' preferences, be it in the negotiations on the state level or an individual level. So without going too much into detail, we could say that these reframings respond to some of the issues mentioned above in the way climate change has been treated historically. First, this literature calls for an end to the exclusively global, or rather intergovernmental, treatment of the problem. It urges us to recognize and value the potential of polycentric and bottom-up initiatives in confronting the climate crisis. Second, what emerges from parts of this literature is an understanding of climate politics, or of decarbonization, as it is frequently called nowadays, not as a technical, but as a profoundly political issue. that involves transforming social and political institutions that perpetuate high-carbon lifestyles. The emergence of these literatures and ideas has gone hand in hand with some important changes in climate negotiations themselves. The new climate politics are more bottom-up than top-down. They are based on national contributions rather than legally binding commitments, and they give room for subnational initiatives through, for example, what is called the Lima Paris Action Agenda or Agenda of Solutions. However, these developments are far from uncontroversial. Bottom-up action is essentially a response to the impossibility of imposing binding commitments to the US and major emerging economies. And the impact of the Lima Paris Action Agenda is yet to be seen. Like comparable earlier initiatives at the global level, it might be largely symbolic. Another important notion emerged in the climate debate, that of co-benefits of climate policies. And I think it is important because it entails a new way of linking climate policies to issues of development, to other environmental problems, and to questions of public health. Such an embedding of climate policies in the wider social and political realities of our world is a crucial, yet insufficient, first step to overcoming the compartmentalization of the climate problem that I described earlier. So, this is the reframings in the literature. Now we can ask ourselves, or we can ask, how is it in the negotiation text? And so, I did a very simple exercise, which is to analyze 4 important texts: the Climate Convention, the Kyoto Protocol, and 2 recent negotiation draft papers, the Geneva text from February 2015, and the last text coming out of the Bonn intercessions, so the negotiations leading up to the Paris negotiations. So this last paper is of October 2015. These 2 last texts sketch, the Geneva and the Bonn text, sketch the probable shape of the future Paris Agreement, if there will be indeed such an agreement. The research I did, as I said, is very simple. I wanted to know how often and in which context the following terms were used in these texts: energy, fossil, renewable, trade, emissions. Here are the results. First of all, at the international level, climate politics are overwhelmingly conceived of in terms of emissions, and emissions only. Although we know that energy and trade-related questions are at the heart of the problem, that fossil fuel subsidies are a major concern because they cause carbon lock-in, and that renewables deployment could be a partial but important response to the problem, these issues are barely ever mentioned in the negotiation texts. If we look closer at how they are mentioned, if they are, it gets even worse. So energy questions in the Climate Convention and Kyoto Protocol are essentially mentioned to highlight the right of development of developing countries, as here. Their energy consumption will need to grow, taking into account the possibilities for achieving greater energy efficiency. Or they are mentioned to ensure that fossil fuel exporting countries potentially harmed by, quote, adverse effects of response measures, so not of climate change, of response measures to climate change, will be compensated somehow. Trade issues are mentioned to ensure not to restructure trade or to rethink how the global economy works, but to ensure, quote, that measures taken to combat climate change should not constitute a disguised restriction to international trade. Looking at the Geneva text, we see for the first time the mentioning of 2 new issues: necessary financial support to renewables and energy efficiency, the first point, and the phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies. These issues, however, have been deleted from the negotiation text in the subsequent Bonn intercessions and will not be on the table in Paris. Why is this important? You can see one development here, and I will not go into really explaining the graph, but just to give you an idea, energy investments in renewable energy have been very important in the last decades. This is one of the, you could say, positive surprises that are largely independent of international climate negotiations. And just to give you one idea or one figure, half of investments in new electricity production in the last year globally were in renewables, which could be a development that is important and that should be encouraged. But you can't encourage it if you don't talk about it. And also it has to be relativized. If you look at this graph, here you see global energy subsidies. The blue is fossil fuel subsidies, the rest is for renewables. So now let's come to climate change in the Anthropocene. So what about the Anthropocene narrative? Can it and how help us to rethink the climate issue? Here are two iconic images of the Anthropocene debate. Both have been showed already. On the left, the great acceleration, characterized by an exponential increase of the human footprint on ecosystems and various global chemical and physical cycles. Second, the 9 planetary boundaries defined by John Rockström and Will Stefan and their colleagues that define limits for human interference in the Earth system, such as a limit for global warming, the famous 2-degree threshold, a limit for biodiversity loss, for perturbations of the nitrogen cycle, and so on. The authors warn that beyond these limits, systemic effects and tipping points might cause irreversible and uncontrollable change in the Earth system. So how does this impact or change our view on the climate problem? Much has been said in these 1.5 days about the usefulness and the pitfalls of the Anthropocene narrative for confronting the current ecological crises, the many crises. I will subsume these under 2 headings, embedding and detaching. On the one hand, the very origins of the Anthropocene concept in Earth system sciences provides an answer to one of the major problems in current climate debates. Climate change is not the only ecological problem. And it is intrinsically linked to other problems like biodiversity loss and ocean acidification, to name only 2. System thinking not only highlights the links between different problems and the risk of trying to tackle one problem by worsening the other, but also those between human and non-human systems, between human activities and their many non-human environments. On the other hand, of course, and this has also been stressed, the technophile legacy of system thinking also revives fantasies of disincarnated steering and global control that were prominent in Cold War approaches to the environment. This is illustrated by citations like the following, taken from one of the founding articles of the Anthropocene narrative in the 2002 paper by Paul Crutzen. A daunting task lies ahead for scientists and engineers to guide society towards environmental sustainable management during the era of the Anthropocene. This will require, he writes, appropriate human behavior at all scales and may well involve internationally accepted large-scale geoengineering projects, for instance, to optimize climate. The recent inclusion of the concept of net zero emissions in the Bonn negotiation text shows that such thought experiments are becoming all too real. The notion suggests that we may allow for a temporal overshooting of emissions in the middle of the century if we implement negative emission technologies afterwards. What are negative emission technologies? They imply mainly large-scale biomass combustion with carbon capture and storage, and probably a variety of small-scale to large-scale geoengineering technologies. Of course, such developments are highly problematic. Paradoxically, it seems that the combination of political stalemate on the climate issue and of the paralyzing effect of the global framing of the question have led to a situation in which the human and social systems are seen as too rigid to be transformed, whereas large-scale intervention in natural systems, intervention whose effects we cannot possibly foresee, is seen as increasingly unproblematic. To reflect on this further, I propose to come back to an image from a wonderful text of Tim Ungold that some of you probably know, Globes and Spheres, in which he discusses the notion of the global environment. Just like the Anthropocene, this notion has been criticized as anthropocentric, as it seemingly places the human at the center. Ingold responds to this criticism by showing that the attitude this notion reveals is better described as anthropo-circumferentialism. very easy notion. So anthropo-circumferentialism. Rather than placing the human at the center, it withdraws human presence to the periphery of the life world. The paradoxical notion of the global environment, he suggests, radicalizes a process of separation. I think current discussions about and critiques of the Anthropocene can be analyzed through the same angle. The basic question is the Anthropocene a new way of dwelling in the world, of living within and with it, or a new way of extricating ourselves from this world, be it to repair the damages that we have caused? To say it differently, in response to the globalizing and detached image of the geological vision of the Anthropocene, what can be an anthropos for the Anthropocene? An anthropos, not the one that is responsible only, but an anthropos capable of agency that could invent, carry out, and enact a response to the disruptions that characterize our current global condition. Here are some images that I think can help, each alone and the three together, to think about agency in the Anthropocene and about what dwelling in our world in the Anthropocene could look like. The first image is an occupation by the divest movement of a lignite coal mine in Germany. The second is a rally against the XXL Keystone pipeline in the US, a project that aims at transporting oil extracted from Canadian tar sands to the American market. The third shows activists protesting against the airport project Notre-Dame-des-Landes in France. In the three cases, these protests materialize and territorialize the abstract climate change problem. This is what Ami talked about yesterday. It is not emissions that are the question here. It's concrete infrastructures and interests and their impact on local environments and livelihoods that are at the center of activism. In the three cases also, the link between global climate change and local impacts and issues is explicitly established by the activists. Occupying the Garzweiler coal mine, which is the first image at the top, for example, is at the same time a protest against the displacement of thousands of people and the visible incarnation of a movement against the carbon lock-in that the exploitation of this coal mine implies and that it perpetuates. Of course, this is also exemplified by the slogan at the right, non à l'aéroport et à son monde. Finally, all three of these movements are internationalized by various degrees. Considering the gridlock in international negotiations, I'm convinced that only a convergence, a linking of multiple locally anchored social movements could create a bottom-up dynamic sufficiently strong to oblige governments to act. They also construct a new form of globality to confront global climate change, a globality that is not opposed to the local, the territory, the material. So to end this talk, some concluding remarks. Ulrich Beck hoped that the global risks that he helped to frame and to see and to make productive for the social sciences would provoke the emergence of global risk communities that create new solidarities and invent new forms of political action. Yesterday, Philippe Descolas suggested the necessity of inventing a new relative in universalism, a universalism that emerges through linking, through the creation of new ties and relationships between humans and non-humans. Latour calls for the unification of earthlings against what he calls the moderns. All three, I think, point to the necessity of new forms of alliances, not to do some fine steering in the Earth system, but to confront existing power structures and to challenge dominating framings of the climate issue. This is what is needed to preserve and to build a world that we can inhabit and would still like to dwell in the future.